I want you to picture a scene that unfolds as such. You and your family travel across the world, pursuing a better future for you and your descendants. And to some degree, you have achieved such a goal. Your family resides in a close-knit community with people just like yourself. A prospering community somewhere within the bounds of Oregon, USA. If you're not in Oregon, perhaps you're in California or Washington. Folks like you spend years, often decades, building a sense of generational stability within your community. You watch places such as Nihonmachi, also known as Little Japan, prosper for over 50 years. I'm finally home, you would think. It is unfortunate that such a home was starting to crumble within mere days after the bombings of Pearl Harbor. The era of World War II saw the rise of one of the darkest segments of US history, and world history for that matter. The Japanese Americans were the ones hit the hardest, while other demographics such as the Filipinos continued to fight against their exploiters. Towards the end of this era, the Korean War will bring forth a new wave of immigrants to the United States who, like various other Asian immigrants before them, will also have their share of discrimination. Let's start our story before the storm. In Oregon, there is a relatively well-known predominantly Japanese neighborhood known as Nihonmachi. From the 1930s to the Second World War, Nihonmachi was a very vibrant Japanese-American town with over 100 thriving businesses. It was home to many Japanese-American professionals. The town had a modest arrangement of hotels, grocery stores, legal services, low-rent apartments, essentially anything a community might need to thrive. When the 1940s rolled around, Japantowns such as those in Oregon really began to prosper. These neighborhoods also resided in other West Coast states such as Washington and California. Unfortunately, such prosperity seemed to vanish overnight. The following day of the 1941 Pearl Harbor bombing marks the beginning of the end of early 20th century Japanese prosperity. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps during the World War. A typical Japanese internment camp family will only be allowed one suitcase full of their belongings before being forced onto a train. Once they got off that train, they'll be led into a large enclosure lined with barbed wire.
I entered Heart Mountain at the age of 9.
That's Samuel Manhara, one of the handful of internment camp survivors today.
The government tried to deliver the message to us that it was our duty to participate in this activity as an act of loyalty to the government, and by doing so and by not complaining, we were showing our allegiance to the U.S.
Anyone of even partial Japanese descent were forced into these camps. They were made to wear tags and were required to give up their homes and all their assets. The government also froze their bank accounts. The detention centers comprised of makeshift barracks that were formerly stables, and the residents who lived in these quarters were grossly undersupplied. Many people weren't getting the medical attention they needed, and the unsanitary conditions of these camps certainly didn't help either. The children were taught in poorly organized grammar schools, but soon there was also a shortage of these schools. Malnutrition was all too common within these camps. The fact that weather conditions were extreme while the Japanese within these camps lacked supplies to beat the elements only escalated sickness. Harsh conditions of these camps led to the death of at least 1,862 due to disease. While the Japanese suffer within these enclosures, another demographic is currently fighting a war for a country that never seems to treat them well or keep their promises. At least 250,000 Filipinos fought with American troops during World War II, 10,737 of whom served within the US Armed Forces. After the infamous Bataan Death March of 1942, most of the fighting against the Japanese Imperials was done by the Filipino locals. This resulted in the deaths of millions of Filipinos. You would assume after all this sacrifice, the United States would at least recognize this demographic for their hard work and dedication. Unfortunately, in 1946, the US Congress passed legislation that stripped any recognition for Filipino soldiers that fought in the war. This was also the year when the Philippines became an independent nation. The third wave of Filipino-American immigrants composed of war veterans who were given the opportunity to become US citizens. The War Brides Act of 1946 allowed Filipinos who served in the US military to bring their wives, children, and other dependents into the country. A wave of Filipino exchange professionals also immigrated to the United States, representing representing one of the most significant brain drains to America. Even though the Filipino immigrant workforce was increasing, while the post-war economy experienced great increase in productivity, some of the immigrant workers were being paid and treated less than fairly. That mistreatment led to Filipinos being one of the leading demographics in various labor movements throughout the 50s and 60s. In 1965, Filipino grape farmers in America went on strike against poor working conditions and low wages. This sparked a wave of other farm workers across the United States joining in with the same demands. This movement grew so exponentially and was so effective that it led to the international boycott of grapes. Fortunately for the workers, their efforts paid off, for they walked away with union contracts and benefits. While the Filipinos share a long and bittersweet history with the United States, a new wave of immigrants will emerge within the borders with a similar relationship with the country. The Korean immigrants who came to the United States around the 1950s were actually part of the second wave of Korean American immigrants. The first significant wave of Korean immigrants were similar to early Japanese. They moved to Hawaii and California to be farm laborers working in pineapple and sugarcane fields. From 1905 to 1924, around 2,000 Korean immigrants moved to Hawaii and California to join the existing plantation workers. Unfortunately, this wave came to a halt when Congress passed the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924, which banned all Asian immigrants except for a select few students to study abroad in US institutions. There wouldn't be another major wave until after World War II. The War Bride Act of 1946 allowed Korean wives of US soldiers, the biological children of these couples, and the adopted children of US servicemen to enter the United States after World War II. Unfortunately for the military brides, the vast majority were only permitted to stay on military bases and facilities. The biological children of these women, also known as GI babies, faced a three-sided form of discrimination. They were fatherless, they were quote-unquote racially impure, and their mothers were treated like prostitutes. When it came to the adopted babies, 41% were quote-unquote fully blooded Koreans, 46 had white fathers, and the rest were African Koreans. Many of these children were adopted into white Christian families. Alongside the war brides, there was a small wave of Korean professionals and students who also immigrated to the US. This wave was heavily influenced by the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, which upheld a quota system that determined eligibility by skill set and familial ties to the United States. Said system strongly favored Asian immigrants who are either students or have a white-collared background. Needless to say, poor Asian laborers, as seen before, were barred out of the country. So how does it end for this era of Asian American immigrants? The Japanese internment camps came to their conclusion in 1945. The remaining detainees were given a mere $25 each and a single train ticket back to their pre-war home. Unfortunately, they found that there was no home for them to return to. Many of the older ex-detainees were never able to rebuild their lives again. It wasn't until 1988 when the United States officially apologized for the incarceration of Japanese Americans. As for the Filipino Americans, they would continue to advocate for the labor rights of all workers. They continued to strike and became one of the most influential demographics in the history of American labor rights activism. As for the Korean Americans, while the quota on Asian immigrants was lifted in 1965, the system still strongly favored immigrants of professional and academic background. They will soon be used as a demographic to represent what is known today as the model minority. Thank you for tuning into this month's DisOriented. My name is Alan Pugh, and I'll see you next month when we discuss more attributes of the model minority myth. But until then, good night.